Sheriff Chitwood publicly blasted Judge McNeely for releasing reality TV star Salome Jackson without requiring proof of legitimate bond funds. Jackson faces charges for allegedly defrauding victims of $198,000 in fake real estate scheme involving shell companies. Judge removed $300,000 bond condition requiring verification that funds didn't originate from criminal activity before release. Sheriff urged voters to remember Judge's decision during re-election, escalating dispute into political challenge against her record. Jackson was arrested at airport before international flight to Colombia following 11-month fraud investigation.
Salome Jackson, better known as Betty Idol. She appeared on Love and Hip Hop Atlanta and Cartel Crew. Investigators say Jackson became involved in a nearly $200,000 real estate fraud scheme in Florida. What happens when a vacant piece of land becomes the center of a nearly $200,000 scam? And investigators say a reality television star ended up receiving most of the money. A former Love and Hip Hop Atlanta personality known as Betty Idol, whose real name is Salome Jackson, has been arrested in Florida and charged in connection with an alleged real estate fraud and money laundering scheme. But this story gets even more complicated. Investigators say the property was never actually for sale. Fake identities were allegedly used. Money traveled through multiple bank accounts and shell companies. And after an investigation that lasted nearly a year, detectives say they were able to trace approximately $179,000 of the stolen money directly to Jackson. And now there is another controversy. After her arrest, the Florida sheriff publicly criticized Jackson to be released on bond. So how did this alleged scheme begin? How did nearly $200,000 disappear? And how did investigators eventually connect the money to a reality television personality? Let's go back to the beginning. The property that was never for sale. According to investigators, the case began with two people in Volusia County, Florida, who owned a mobile home park in Orange City. The couple became interested in purchasing a vacant parcel of land next to their property on North Thorpe Avenue. There was a land for sale sign on the property, and the potential buyers believed they were dealing with legitimate real estate professionals and the actual owners of the land. That is where the alleged deception began. Investigators say the people behind the transaction were not actually authorized to sell the property. The real owner of the land later told investigators that the property was not for sale. According to investigators, someone had allegedly assumed the identity of the property owner and provided fraudulent identification and documents to make the transaction appear legitimate. And apparently, the setup was convincing enough that the buyers proceeded with the purchase. TH initially sent a $2,000 deposit. They then proceeded with what they believed was the closing of a legitimate real estate transaction. According to investigators, they ultimately wired $196,786.65 for the property. But then something went wrong. The buyers began having trouble reaching the people they had been donal information about the property. Instead, investigators say they were given excuses and eventually had difficulty contacting the supposed realtor and escrow officer. That's when the victims began to realize that something wasn't right. They contacted the escrow company, whose name had apparently been used during the transaction. And that's when another bombshell allegedly emerged. The company told them that it did not conduct the closing, and the person they had been dealing with was not actually employed by the company. Investigators also learned that scammers had apparently been using the company's name. The land transaction the victims thought was legitimate was allegedly a fraud. The real owner had no idea. Investigators then contacted the actual owner of the property. According to authorities, the real owner confirmed that the land had never been legitimately placed on the market. Even more troubling, investigators say the identification documents supposedly belonging to the property owner were fraudulent. Authorities reportedly determined that a copy of the owner's driver's license used in the paperwork was fake. At this point, investigators were no longer looking at a simple dispute over a piece of property. They were described as a coordinated real estate fraud scheme, following the money. This is where the investigation became much more complicated. Investigators say the nearly $200,000 didn't simply move from the victim's account into one suspect's account. Instead, the money allegedly traveled through a network of accounts and businesses. Authorities obtained warrants involving approximately 14 bank accounts and began tracing transactions, debit card activity, purchases, and cash withdrawals. Some of the accounts, investigators say, were connected to people whose identities had themselves allegedly been stolen. Money reportedly moved through accounts in several states, including New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And investigators say the trail eventually led to Salome Jackson. How did they identify Betty Idle? Accord, one important piece of evidence involved a bank transaction. Authorities subpoenaed records connected to a deposit made in New York. Investigators say surveillance footage showed a woman depositing a check at an ATM. That woman was later identified as Salome Jackson. Authorities say facial recognition and Jackson's distinctive tattoos, including a tattoo beneath her eye and another on her neck, helped investigators make the identification. Investigators then continued following the financial trail. According to the sheriff's office, App's stolen money ultimately could be connected to Jackson. Authorities allege that she had direct control over accounts used to receive, transfer, withdraw, and launder the money. She appeared as a supporting cast member during the 5th season of Love and Hip Hop, Atlanta, and later appeared on VH1's Cartel Crew. But now, instead of appearing on reality television, Jackson found herself at the center of a criminal investigation. Say they spent approximately 11 months putting the case together before making the arrest. On August 13, 2026, Volusia County deputies arrested 40-year-old Salome Jackson. Felonies, including money laundering involving a transaction of $100,000 or more, grand theft of more than $100,000, organized scheme to defraud, use of another person's identification without consent. These are serious allegations, but it is important to emphasize that an arrest and criminal charges are not a conviction. Jackson is entitled to defend herself in court, and the allegations must ultimately be proven. Then, the case took another turn. You might think the arrest would be the end of the story. A dispute erupted over her bond. According to reports, her bond was set at $300,000. But Volusia County Sheriff Mike Chitwood became publicly critical of the judge's handling of the case. The sheriff argued that Jackson should have had to demonstrate that the money being used to secure her release did not come from criminal activity. According to reporting published today, that requirement was later removed, allowing Jackson to post bond and leave custody. The sheriff publicly expressed his frustration with the decision and questioned whether the court was seriousness as investigators who had spent almost a year building it. That created a second controversy surrounding the case. Not just the alleged fraud itself, but the question of how a defendant accused of receiving nearly $179,000 in allegedly stolen funds should be handled while the criminal case moves forward. What happens next? At this point, the criminal case is not over. The investigation may continue. Jackson will have the opportunity to challenge the allegations against her, and prosecutors will have to prove their case in court. What investigators have presented so far is a complicated alleged scheme involving a property that was never legitimately for sale, fraudulent identities, fake documentation, multiple bank accounts, and the movement of nearly $200,000 across several states. And authorities say the financial trail ultimately led them to someone many viewers already knew from reality television. But there is still one major question hanging over this case. Was Betty Idle actually a central player in the alleged scheme? Or will her defense present a very different explanation for why nearly $179,000 of the allegedly stolen money ended up connected to her? That question will ultimately have to be answered in court. And there you have it, a reality television personality, a piece of land that investigators say was never actually for sale, nearly $200,000 allegedly taken from unsuspecting buyers, and an investigation that took almost a year to unravel. But remember, these are allegations, not a conviction. As this case develops, there may be more evidence, more court hearings, and possibly more people connected to the investigation. So what do you think about this case? Do you think investigators have followed the money far enough to uncover the entire story, or could there be more people involved who haven't been identified yet? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to stay updated as this story develops, like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notifications so you don't miss the next update. Because sometimes the story behind the headlines is where the real story begins.